It's a real pleasure to be here. I was here actually in 2016, and yesterday I thought I'll have a look at what I presented in 2016 and see just how much things have changed. And I have to say I was honestly completely amazed, because sometimes we talk a lot, when I talk with other people who work in digital, we talk about this feeling of there being a sort of plateauing of technology, of especially consumer technology, the technology we see in our pockets, no longer having these big leaps that we used to see when we saw mobile really disrupting things. But in actual fact, that's not true. It's becoming more invisible, it's becoming more deeper integrated with everything we do. And that is, of course, one of the biggest challenges we have to face as an industry. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the shifting consumer mindset, but importantly, how the narrative is also shifting as well towards looking at how we can be more sustainable as an industry, and of course the role of digital and technology in doing that. So I know that this is a room full of technology and digital people. I think we can already see that from the first Slido poll. So I hope there's going to be lots of great ideas for you, and I'm looking forward to seeing what your thoughts are later on today. So first of all, just a quick introduction to myself. My name's Nick Hall. I'm the founder and CEO of the Digital Tourism Think Tank. We work with tourist boards all around the world, and we help them to understand and navigate all of the trends that are happening in digital and in the industry. And we're often brought in and working together with the tourist board and all of their local industry. And one of the things that I can tell you is no matter where I go in the world, from somewhere like Greenland and Norway to Singapore and California, the challenges that are faced by the industry are always very similar. There's challenges related to resources. There's challenges in keeping up with digital. There's challenges in being able to stay relevant and connected, and also to go after all of the new trends and platforms, and this kind of overwhelming feeling that a lot of businesses in this industry have. And it really doesn't matter what part of the world you're in, or how wealthy or not so wealthy the country is. These are challenges which are faced by the industry everywhere I go. So I think this should at least perhaps be reassuring that anybody who feels overwhelmed and that all of the steps that we keep taking in digital are sometimes hard to keep up with, it's certainly a challenge that's felt all over the world. So first of all, I think, just something I always stress at the start of any talk is that whatever we do, we should be relentlessly user-driven. And by users, we also talk about our visitors. We used to think about a user-focused strategy, and we used to always think about that as something that is purely about online. But this very much applies to the real world and the real experiences we create, as it does to the digital environment as well. And so we always need to keep that top of mind. When we see an opportunity, when we see a trend, or when we see a new technology, we need to ask ourselves, what impact, what difference, and what improvement will this make to our users? And we shouldn't go after things unless they will make an incredible improvement. The other thing is that we've spoken a lot about content over the last few years, and it's really important as brands that we understand the huge role and importance of content in actually shaping the image and the identity of our brand, actually showing people both what we have to offer, but the depth of that, and the personality of that, and the authenticity of that. Because of course, tourism and the strength of tourism and the differentiator in tourism is actually all coming down to how authentic and how connected and engaged we are, and how much we're creating those experiences with our customers. So we always need to keep that at the top of mind. Now, where technology comes in is actually where we can create incredible experiences for our customers. And an incredible experience can also be very simple. It can be as simple as creating a seamless booking experience, which is somehow leaving us with a very happy feeling that it wasn't an awful experience. It's actually a really good experience. But it can also be completely transforming the actual experience when we're in the business, in the attraction, in the destination, and using technology to make that an even better experience. So I'm going to touch on some of those points today. And I'm going to start by sort of giving you like an overview of how we see the landscape changing. We used to see the visitor cycle as a very linear awareness, conversion, experience funnel. And actually, I think most of us would love to go back to those days where we had really clear, different things we did at each step in that funnel. We knew exactly which channels were going to work. We knew exactly who would play the strongest role and who we would count on or partner with for different aspects of that. And we would really know how to kind of navigate through that in a fairly simplistic way. But of course, digital has completely changed things. And perhaps about 10 years ago, we saw the rise of mobile, and with that, the rise of social. And we started to think about the need to have a view on the visitor cycle being more like an infinite loop, recognizing that word of mouth in the destination, that what people say about our experience, whether that's a hotel review, and we all know the importance we've put on TripAdvisor, and now that's sort of augmented to Google reviews and all the other channels as well, through to the power of social to actually convince and persuade friends and family and peers to actually go and do that experience themselves. And now we talk a lot about social proof. So social is now used to validate a brand message. You know, if we say something, that's great, but still our customers need to validate that and see that other people also have that experience that we promise. And now we're in a situation where actually the brand touch points are completely fragmented. They're completely scattered. Average search when we start to plan a trip will be over 200 different searches. And not just one or two channels, but also across a huge, huge variety of different touch points. In fact, it's become harder and harder just to have a simple strategy without actually using data to completely understand the behaviors, the patterns, and how our visitors actually come to make decisions. And it's also harder and harder to do that in a more manual and analog way. We need to be smarter, we need to be able to automate, and we need to be able to actually use technology to understand and trigger different stories, different reactions, different messages, and different offers, depending on where that consumer is, depending on the context of that consumer, and depending on the whole environment of everything that led up to and everything that will lead after that point. So the visitor cycle is no longer linear, it's no longer simple, and actually the average number of touch points before someone travels to a destination related to that experience is in excess of 400. So we have to really take that into consideration, that that's no longer something we can simply have a very simple strategy and understand exactly which touch points are going to deliver. So I'm going to come back to data, but I want to start by talking about value-driven experiences, because the message of today, hopefully you'll see that at the end, is all about how do we create value. And to understand that, we have to also understand where that stems from. We've spoken a lot about millennials over the last few years and the importance of the millennial traveler, the fact that the millennial traveler is now our largest group of travelers, and what is it that actually drives millennials to have to seek out completely different experiences to the generations of travelers before those? We've seen the huge disruption that a player like Airbnb has had to the industry. They've changed the very nature of the industry, and they've changed the very nature of the offer. So we see today, for example, hotel groups are trying to change the overall experience to reflect a more personal, more homely, and a experience which reflects much more living and experiencing a destination like a local than we ever used to do before. And then, of course, Airbnb launched Airbnb Experiences in the last few years. And again, this created a second wave of disruption, a second iteration, if you like, in how we actually think about the offer that we create. And we started then talking much more about how do we create incredible experiences, not just incredible experiences when we stay in a hotel room, but also incredible experiences when we actually visit a city and how we actually want to visit that city as a local and have experiences which are much more in tune with our own niche and very personal interests, where we can actually connect with other people who share those interests. And of course, what you're looking at here is just an example of how Airbnb has done such a brilliant job of curating experiences, almost like a Spotify playlist, and really talking to consumers in a way that actually groups and packages experiences in a much, much more narrowly defined way, much more in a way that talks directly to their interests and talks to their passions. And we see that actually now the industry starts to follow this trend again. We see a player like Airbnb sets a trend and everybody else starts to realize that actually there's a huge demand for this, that people really like this. And this is an example of a tourist board of Nova Scotia that have really seen this trend and kind of understood that actually it's a really interesting way to package and deliver the experience in a destination. They've created an almost playlist-style curation of experiences which are really tailored to people's interests. And they have a very small degree of personalization by simply starting out by asking visitors to their site what they're interested in, what their passions are, and then pulling up a set of experiences which they think are best matched to those. So that's a very simple starting point. We see this whole sector changing very rapidly. Over the last couple of years, one of the biggest entrants to the scene has been a company called Boken. They're an Icelandic company. As you can see, Wow Air no longer exists. And they really changed the model. So they really opened it up, allowed businesses to create and sell their own experiences. But also what's really interesting about a company like Boken is they allowed businesses to pair up and match experiences with other businesses. So in places like Iceland and Finland, you see clusters of businesses now pairing experiences and creating combined experiences and really packaging those in a way that talks directly to people's interests and actually allows the industry to collaborate and come together and to create a set of experiences which is richer, more varied, and of course, through a technology like that, also distributed across many, many different distribution points. And so we started looking into this and sort of thinking about, well, how can a destination start to shape and support businesses to do this? And we developed this experience framework, which is basically sort of bringing it all together, understanding that experiences alone don't work just in isolation. They're a crucial part of the destination's image and the destination's brand. And what's really important is to find as a destination what it is that's the personality of that brand, what's the actual brand match with the product that's on offer, to have a really strong strategy and a really strong collaboration as an industry to organize and curate that offer together, to package it and organize it depending on the interests of your audience and visitor groups, and then, of course, do an incredible job around communicating and storytelling. And we still advocate, which we have done for many, many years, the importance of having a content strategy built around hero, hub, and hygiene. It's a very simple concept, but it allows you to think of the story like a mountain where you develop a greater level of depth as you engage your visitors more through content. And then, of course, packaging and distribution, and looking at the hugely fragmented distribution opportunities that exist for businesses and how they can actually get distribution across all the different channels, as well as building really, really strong brands themselves to get more and more direct bookings. So that brings me to how do you build a really successful brand as a business? And actually, the biggest shift that we've seen, and it's funny, I was talking with Gisela, who's going to be speaking later, about this during the lunch there, is that we've seen a huge shift and a huge appreciation from consumers for aesthetics and a huge appreciation for user experience, which we never had before. And this has, of course, been driven by the improvements in smartphone technology, the ability to have richer, heavier content, which delivers a really immersive experience. And, of course, platforms like Instagram, which are completely visually driven and allow us to tell our stories in a completely different way. And if you think about all the content that you've been creating over the years, think about how you can reorganize, repackage, and redistribute all of that content to tell a visual story. So here's just a few pointers. Think about how you can use your websites to fulfill your existing story. Think about how influencers, oh, that's quite loud, I'll keep moving. Think about how influencers can support the stories that you tell and continue those stories. And think about how all of the different pieces of content that you have, from long-form videos to great articles, can be cut down into small snippets, repackaged and redistributed around a content plan, which helps you develop a stronger identity for the brand. Recently, we met with Tastemade, and they shared this great story about how Tastemade has really found its space talking to a very niche audience of food lovers and foodies all around the world. And this is an audience that comes together not because of their nationality or even their age and demographics, but because of this passion and interest for food. And this is really representative of one of the biggest shifts we've seen because of social and because of the way we consume content. And of course, throughout those channels, you can see one story here that is told consistently across every single channel. And as a brand, they have to think about how one story can play out over all the different channels and how they can format that story for square, for vertical, and even in some cases for long-form content as well, such as detailed articles or also even podcasts where they can actually go deeper on the same story. And they focus on having 5 key things, one of which should be in every story. It should either spark interest, it should create aspiration, it should create humor, it should be addictive, or it should be accessible. And if content fits within one of those points, they know that this content is right for their audience and it delivers what we go back to, which is creating value for those audiences. So when we think about our user needs, we can even think about our users' needs in social. What do people need in social? Well, sometimes they need entertainment. Sometimes they need that bit of inspiration in what might otherwise be a very mundane day. And so finding those user values isn't always about function. It's also about understanding what's actually going to lift up or make a difference to your target audience's days. But what's really key here is that when we think about social, that we don't think about it in a whimsical way. We have to think about social as an opportunity to tell our story in a really consistent way, to really understand what our brand is about and how to communicate that throughout the year and touch on all the different points that we want to touch on, which is where it's really important to actually approach a channel like Instagram with a really solid plan. Really prepare the content sets, prepare sets around different themes, and prepare sets of content around different times of the year. And one of the things I would really recommend as well is also prepare a consistent visual identity. It's really important that we actually think about how to build an identity through a channel like Instagram. Just as this brand has done on their website, they want to portray themselves as more than just a hotel, but a sort of a lifestyle and a lifestyle brand. And they have this very classical way of pulling together the offer, of doing some really great storytelling around that, and bringing together both the lifestyle that their hotel represents, but also a bit about the experience they create and the heritage they create. So something as simple as a hotel is obviously much more than just a building with rooms. It's an experience that you try to create. A completely radically different example is this hostel in Iceland, which have a very bold, very kind of in-your-face approach of communicating. They talk to a different audience, a younger audience that wants to have a great experience and wants to know that it's affordable and it's fun. And part of lifting their brand message is creating a set of events. So they create so-called experiences which lift the brand further. They take people outside of the hostel and they actually represent an experience in Iceland, not just a place to stay in Iceland. So understanding what your values are and communicating them to your audience is really, really important in digital. We're in a period where transparency is really key and brand transparency is really key. And when people make a choice to stay in a hotel, to book an experience, or to do almost anything, this is increasingly a consideration, is what does this brand represent? And do they represent values that I'm in tune with? And to give you an example of how important it is to show who is behind the brand and that personality, one of my favorite meetings with businesses over the last few years has been the owners of this coffee shop called Locks. They spent 6 months designing the experience that they would have inside the coffee shop and doing that together with their followers on Instagram. Before they opened the coffee shop, they had 3,500 followers on Instagram, and they had a huge opening with a massive party, and now they're really, really a very successful business. And they're also an example of a business which has launched itself recently and actually doesn't even have a website, but they have huge success and a huge following because they've used the opportunity of a channel like Instagram to build a story, to build an engagement with their followers, and to show them who they really are and the passion that they have for their business. And that really comes across through every aspect of the business, and even involving their followers in the choices that they make, whether it's the the paint that they put on the walls or the furniture that they choose. They use Instagram to create that interactivity with visitors. And obviously this is very important and successful for them. So then once we've created a strong identity, a strong image, a strong set of values which we communicate within the experience that we offer, that's where data can really, really play a powerful role. And yesterday I was actually in Madrid, and funnily enough I bumped into Eileen Lam as well, so that was quite a coincidence. And I was meeting with a few different companies. And I met with a company called TapTap, which really, really specializes in using data and creating technology to have a much more targeted approach to marketing, and particularly to paid media. And I also spoke with the Spanish Tourist Board, and I think one of the things which was a real eye-opener for me is just how far we've come when we think about data. So to give you an example, the Spanish Tourist Board is using all of these different types of targeting to engage with potential visitors to Spain at different points in the funnel. And just to touch on a couple of those, geospatial intelligence is actually allowing them to target people who, for example, are visiting a golf club in the US who may be interested in golf in Spain, and actually able to track them at the point where they visit a golf club in the US and build messaging throughout all the different channels that they visit. And then when they come to Spain, continue building that messaging when they're in Spain. So truly tracking every single step of the journey and understanding not only what they browse and what they consume online, but also how they behave and what they do in the destination. There's obviously huge questions around data and privacy there, but the reality is that marketing today has become really, really sophisticated, and the tools we have at our disposal are really incredible. And so it comes down to us as brands, as marketeers, to understand what we can do with the resources and the budget we have, right down to the platforms we use every day. So Facebook Business, for example, and all the data tools that exist just within that very off-the-shelf consumer offering, right through to the macro level where we can do really incredible things with that kind of physical tracking of people. And ultimately, data is playing a role at every single point in our business, from how we even define a brand and the tone, understanding what works, what ways of talking to consumers work, through to how we create the user experience and the visitor experience, through to obviously then how we push people down to conversion. What sort of sales, what kind of deals, what kind of messages work for our visitors. And so we have to really look at every aspect of our strategy, every aspect of our business, and think, where is data going to give us more insights, better information, and allow us to test and understand what works and what doesn't, iterate and optimize, as well as tracking the behavior through all the different touch points. I'm going to come back to that towards the end, but I want to now touch on the experience, because I spoke about experiences quite a lot, and it's quite incredible to see. I think it was 20% of the people in this room have done something with AR and VR. And this is one of the biggest shifts. And it's also a huge experiment with the world we're living in. Actually, Google recently announced they were getting rid of one of their VR projects. Actually, it hasn't had the traction that they wanted. And what they realized is that VR is an incredible technology. It can do incredible things, but it cuts people off from the world around them. You put on a headset and you're immediately excluded from everything around you. So the use cases are actually interesting, but perhaps not something you can apply in every single marketing situation. Whereas things like voice and things like AR are still in that experimentation phase. AR is seen as something that offers a huge amount of potential because it doesn't cut you off. It actually augments everything around you and can actually potentially enhance experiences. And this whole space is being referred to as XR, effectively a mixed reality, somewhere between having a reality in the real world and having a completely virtual reality. And actually, we are creating XR experiences every day, more and more, in tourism. Here's just some examples of how AR can transform experiences that we have in places which are completely disconnected. So this middle app is a prototype of an app which allows you to interact with nature in your environment and leave messages and leave things for other users to discover when they visit that. You can sort of plant your own tree with messages. The example on the left is a great example of how a restaurant experience can be completely transformed with a visual, an interactive, and a mobile-based menu. And just think about how you could create interactions within your business which completely transform the experience for your customers. And in fact, the only limit is your creativity and your ideas, and going back to the users, whether there is the demand and whether that will really transform and help users to have a better experience. Or will it just be a distraction or a gimmick that actually you invest a lot and don't see the results? We see tourist boards really starting to move with voice now, and some hotel brands, and also other brands like tour operators are starting to experiment with how they can use voice. We also see some really interesting trials of new technology coming out as well. And I think this encourages us to always stay curious. Sometimes the value that technology can have is not necessarily in the mass adoption, but in the PR and the story that we can create around the business. So it's important to kind of understand what we want to see as a result. Here's an example of a tour of Austria, which is around the story of Beethoven, where they've teamed up with Bose to create what they call a audio augmented reality experience, where you actually experience the city and you hear different sounds and soundscapes as you visit the city using these Bose sunglasses, which have audio built in. So it's a really transformative experience that takes you into a kind of different dimension of the destination. I think it's a really, really great example as well of creating a mixed reality experience. You can do that as a promotional effort, but if you're in the business of delivering experiences, you can build a new experience which is digitally enhanced. And just last week I was in Ljubljana and we worked with businesses, and one of the businesses came up with a concept to get people to the peak of a mountain and get them to then experience all the nature, the bears, and all these animals that they really want to see around them using AR during the night without actually endangering their lives by doing it. So, there's so many ways that you can create experiences on top of existing ones. Some of the best examples are theme parks and cruise ships. They have the luxury of a totally controlled, confined environment where they can dictate exactly how the consumer experiences every aspect. So I'm showing here just an example of Royal Caribbean. Of course, they have all the budget in the world to invest in new technology, and sometimes companies like this do a pretty lousy job of it as well, I have to say. But it allows them to create a unified digital experience and then tap into all the opportunities that come with that, from upselling to navigating and supporting visitors to have an even better experience. But as businesses, perhaps with less budget, we can also think about how some of those elements can come into play within our own strategies. Here's an example of a business that I have a huge amount of respect for. They started about 3 years ago. They're called Up Norway, and they've tried to focus on creating luxury experiences in Norway. So they focus just on the premium market. And they've built their whole offer around an extremely digital experience at every point when they engage with their visitors. And one of the key things which is really great about this is you tailor your journey through a kind of online tool which takes you step by step about the kind of thing you want to feel, the kind of experience you want to have, and you curate your own trip. And there's that level of control that today's consumers really want to have that you get matched with, oh, there we go, the sound was on there, matched with the level of personalization that you also want from a premium experience. And I think it's a great example of how, yes, you can automate and you can digitize a lot of aspects of what we do today, but you can also create a very personal and premium experience at the same time. So once you've made your trip and booked your trip, they send you your entire itinerary through a travel planner, and you have somebody who supports you throughout that trip who you can engage and talk with using chat. This is not a chat bot, this is just chat. So, it's fairly analog as things go. But it's a great user experience, and their customer satisfaction rate is just through the roof. It's incredible. And they are not developing technology, in fact. They're using existing technology, and they're plugging it in and integrating it into all the digital platforms they have. There are chat services, there are so many now. You can even integrate Facebook Messenger into your site. But they use a chat service called Intercom, which we use, which can be really seamlessly integrated with no code at all. So actually, a lot of this technology is very readily available for all of us to use today. And it really comes down to how we want to build that customer experience and what tools are going to help us there. This is an example of a bike business in the US that's gone from 40 bikes to 4,000. They're hugely, hugely successful and clearly are leading in this whole space. But the reason I'm showing this is because I want to show you what the next phase of that experience looks like. And I'm sure many of you will have traveled. In the UK, it's illegal, which I don't get, but most countries around the world, electric scooters are legal and people ride them everywhere, and it's now like a lot of controversy that comes with it as well, because they're considered as pavement junk. But the companies that are creating these, they're building digital product experiences. You book it online, you rent it online, and you take it and you experience it. And it's still very early, but already prototypes and tests are being developed to deliver visitor experiences through things like electric scooters. The next wave of electric scooters will have screens built in. And so if you think about the experiences and everything that you have to offer, that's a new distribution channel that perhaps you didn't even think about a few years ago. And this is a new type of business which is going to disrupt this other business of the traditional bike sharing. So we need to be already thinking about how to integrate technology into our existing experiences. this is one of the companies that I have a huge respect for is a company called Citymapper. I think some of you will surely know about them. And they're trying to completely shake up travel as we know it. They've created an entirely digital-based journey planner, which tries to really experiment on every single aspect of how we travel and how we experience and how we travel around the city. I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but what I want to say is that digital allows us to not only test online user experiences, but also to test product in the real world. This is an example of a company called Optimizely, and they allow marketeers, product owners, brand owners to test almost any type of concept with online users. And they allow you to launch a prototype and then work with users to iterate and develop and refine that prototype. And so you can work with messaging and optimize and change the messaging and see what works better. But you can also go right down to the product level. So companies like Uber experiment all the time. They test, can they do deliveries? Can they deliver food? Can they do partnerships with brands? Would a scooter work? Would a helicopter work? All these different things are things that you can test and run micro or rapid prototypes, which allow you to see, would they work? Is there demand for them? Do people respond? And this is something we simply couldn't have done before. We would have had to plan an entire new concept, an entire new set of products, and then use all the research we could get our hands on, and then cross our fingers and hope that we've done the right research and there is the demand for it. Now, thanks to digital, we can run small tests, even of completely new experiences, and see what the results are. And this is an example, going back to Citymapper, of something they're testing now, which is running their own bus routes. They've actually identified through all the data that they have where there's users that are making very complicated journeys because there isn't a seamless journey that exists today. And so they've tried to plug the gap by creating routes and creating transport options where they can see there's a demand and it's not currently being met today. And they're able to test that with their user base. So think about how you can apply this within your business when you go back home and go back to the office. How can we actually test more and work with users more and work with sponsored users? Automation is one of the biggest things that we're all thinking about, and there are so many ways to do automation, depending on whether we have limitless budgets and we want to develop and work with new things, or whether we want to use off-the-shelf services and tools that are available today. And we see that at every level, businesses are really experimenting with automation, but it's also becoming more and more granular. So it's no longer just chatbots and voice, but it's also going into how we integrate that into our existing services. So for example, many people don't realize this, but there's this thing called Siri Shortcuts where you can effectively voice enable an existing app. So you can quickly call on information using voice. And that's sort of a hybrid voice app that's integrated into existing apps. And anybody who has apps or who has any kind of app ecosystem can integrate that into their current offer. We see completely different examples of new business models which are based on completely automating services that previously weren't automated. And this is an example of a company called Mezi that they automate more than 60% of flight requests through a kind of chat interface, which is something we would have never seen before. And they've really identified a gap in the market. They've already been bought, by the way, by American Express, who saw that there's a huge potential for that. And they wanted to onboard that technology with their existing travel offer. And then things like blockchain, which offer so much potential, but for so many people, such a huge mountain to climb that we can only think about where solutions might exist in the future. But there's already some great examples in travel of companies like Winding Tree that are already offering brilliant solutions for travel. This is one of my favorites. It's a company called Cool Cousin that have created a community of so-called cousins. These are ordinary people who will share their experience and share their tips on a city with you, and you can match yourself with someone who you think represents your interests. So really appealing to that kind of social economy. But they have created so-called Cuz coins, which they've opened it up to investors, and they also are starting to build a reward system into that as well. So their so-called cousins can be rewarded with this cryptocurrency that they've created for themselves there. So it's a really great example of how the social economy is evolving and seeing opportunities in something like blockchain to actually create investment and create an entire currency system that we could have never imagined before. Just like we were saying at the beginning about cash being dead, perhaps traditional currencies will also be dead in the coming years as well. Here's another example of a different company called Kolu that creates virtual city currencies. So many people have probably know about the Bristol pound, but they're creating these digital currencies in many cities around the world, which is all about actually saying, we want to see people spend money locally. We want people to make conscious decisions about where they shop, who they shop with, and making sure they drive more business to independent businesses. And they've created a currency which rewards people for doing that and rewards the businesses by driving a kind of microeconomy that kind of allows the independents to stand out and stand up for themselves in what is a very competitive market space. And then we see completely other examples. This is a cryptocurrency created in the Caribbean called BIT. And they are basically saying, you know, we have all of our currency going out to foreign banks, and we believe we should own that and retain that within the Caribbean. And so they've actually developed this cryptocurrency, and they've also developed a crowdfunding platform to go with that, because they want to see more investment in the destination and more of that wealth staying within the destination themselves. So that brings me to social entrepreneurship and going back to this topic of values. Recently, I was browsing H&M, as you do, and I was completely amazed to see just how much a global brand like H&M has recognized the importance of transparency in how they offer, how they present their offer to their customers. So as you might be able to see here, I select a product, and within the product, I've got all of the credentials about where the material is sourced, where the factory is, even the address and details of the factory and the conditions. And so what they've recognized is that the clothing industry perhaps doesn't have the best reputation when it comes to the manufacturing process. And consumers really want to have that sense of trust and transparency in where they actually buy their products and how they're made. And so they've decided to be very upfront and very transparent in integrating that. And perhaps going with that also means cleaning up practice, also means making sure that your practice is actually something that can be transparent. So ultimately changing the offer at the same time. We see in tourism some great examples of social entrepreneurship. There's a great example in Dublin of a charity which trains homeless people to be local guides. And this is just a great example of how tourism can be a force for good and actually do something really positive in the destination beyond create that wealth in the kind of in the traditional sense. Here's an example of a business in Norway, which is actually a business where you can go out, you can have a tourism experience. It's called In the Same Boat. And basically you go out and you collect rubbish. And so it's not your traditional way of experiencing Norway, but it's actually a great way to experience the fjords, to go out, to have that kind of water experience that so many people want, but actually do something good at the same time. And increasingly, there's more and more demand from consumers to have experiences which have a certain sense of value attached to them. Even in the sort of everyday, when it comes to choosing a hotel, people are looking to see what the credentials and wanting to have that reassurance that this is a business which has good practice, that has a sustainable practice. And this is an example of one of the few businesses in Europe which is B certified. B Corporation is an organization which promotes really good sustainable business practice and social entrepreneurship. And this is an example of just how they communicate that, making a pledge to their customers about their credentials and about what commitment and determination they have to make sure they don't have a negative impact on the environment around them. And this is so important almost in every aspect of business now, that we think about how to communicate our values and also make sure we create businesses which do good and don't just make profit. And so one of the earliest businesses in this space is Patagonia. Patagonia have a whole sort of action page called Patagonia Action Works, which is all about investing and stewardship in communities. And for them, this is really, really important, and it's a huge part of their messaging, and it's a huge part of what defines them as a company. And these two businesses are examples of just two of hundreds of businesses, I think there's nearly 1,000 now, that have followed this B Corporation initiative. And I think if you're interested in learning more about this, or even applying certain good practice principles within your business, have a look at this, because they actually give you all the information. You can even self-assess your own business and see how to apply some of these practices yourselves. And ultimately, this is about responding to the need to be more responsible as a business. This is an example of Helsinki marketing. They've recognized this. They've given themselves 12 years to completely transform the city's offering and make sure it's entirely sustainable, that it's entirely carbon neutral, and that they also consider aspects such as social sustainability and the contribution that tourism makes to society as well. So they've developed a 17-point criteria. They've done this as an entirely digitally led initiative, so they don't certify, they don't go around with inspectors and give you a plaque to put on your business. This is about self-certification, and this is about having a transparency model where consumers can validate whether indeed the business has the credentials that they claim to have. And they're using the power as a marketing organization to also provide a carrot, to create a hook for businesses to transform and change their practice. Because by doing so, they will be first in line to be part of that new brand messaging. So before I close things, I just want to say that at the Digital Tourism Think Tank, we believe hugely in design. We all go through, when everyone joins the business, we go through an IBM design practitioner course, so everyone has to have these basic capabilities to be able to work with us. And this is something that any business can do and put their own teams through. And I really recommend that you look into design and you look into the potential for design thinking. Ultimately, the skills that you have with design thinking allow you to solve any challenges. And the challenges we have today and in the future are not going to be as simple as they've been in the last 10 years. They're going to be increasingly complex. The choices we have are just going to get bigger and bigger. And we have to be selective and make the right choices which respond to our users' needs. And design thinking is all about having a focus on users, having a culture of relentless reinvention, so you continually optimize, iterate, test, learn, and then apply that, and having diverse and empowered teams. So that isn't only the people within the business, but it's how you work with your customers. It's how you actually bring your customers into the process of designing the future decisions you make as a business. When we talk about diverse and empowered teams, one example of that is having sponsored customers that actually test things with us, so-called beta users, which is also something we were speaking about at lunch. So it's very funny how these things come around. And a lot of businesses really understand the importance of design in actually creating and making the right decisions within their business. So start thinking of yourselves as change makers. Think about how you can actually change every aspect of how you communicate and engage with visitors, but also how you design and make the decisions you make. I've got a short interview from, we caught up with a company called Mural, which is rooted in design, and they just have a quick thing to sort of summarize the whole design thinking process in 30 seconds.
It was become a buzzword in the industry, and I think breaking it down to its most fundamental steps, the companies that are deploying and scaling design thinking have followed a practice that often starts with empathizing. So as a first step, you want to empathize with your users, understand the challenges they have, understand why they're using your tool, your software, your hardware, whatever it might be. And that's a great place to start. The second step is using those findings from user research, understanding how to define the problem, and then moving on to things like ideating around the problem. So now that you've understood the users, their challenges, and defined the problem, you can start to understand and ideate around some of the solutions before you then prototype and test.
Okay, so more or less said what I said actually there. So just summarizing that it's really important to test, but it's also, this is a completely different way of thinking about research. Moving away from the traditional way of doing research and actually synthesizing research as we do it. So the last point to end on is the point which I started with, which is sustainability. And what is sustainability to you, to our visitors? In fact, it means different things to different people. For some, it's about the environment and about the ecological impact of our industry and how we can really work to reduce that, from promoting different ways of traveling through to changing the very operational aspects of our business. And for others, it's about what we give back to society and how we make a really positive contribution to the society in which we're rooted. We're a part of that fabric. And we can see that this shift is actually moved very, very rapidly from being something which a few years ago was a niche and was something that was really very specialist or very much focused on the environment, to something which is now understood by everybody at all levels of industry, that is something we must focus on in order to build a really sustainable, strong and solid foundation for the next phase of the tourism industry. And I think many of you will have heard and been aware of Prince Harry launching this new initiative. It was very controversial because there was also the private jets alongside that, which a lot of people had opinions on. But whatever you think of this, I think it demonstrates the times that we live in, and it demonstrates the growing public conscious of how important it is to make sure that we have that transparency and that we understand and we tell our consumers actually, what responsibility we take within the sector that we work in. And they recognize, this is from the Travelist website, so that's the initiative that was launched by Prince Harry with a number of the leading businesses. They really recognize that this is an initiative that's coming from consumer demand, and that they have to respond to that and respond to the impact. At a destination level, this is really one of my favorite examples of the year. It's the Faroe Islands. They created a campaign called Preservolution, and they basically declared that the Faroe Islands was closed for 1 weekend to visitors. Personally, I was very skeptical. I thought this is a gimmick and it's going to bring 10 times as many visitors, very successfully. But actually, when they had the visitors over to the Faroe Islands, these volunteers, not only did they communicate a different sense of what they believe is important to them as a country, which is maintaining the beauty that they have, but they actually had 100 people truly rebuilding all the tourism infrastructure that's been damaged by the last 2 or 3 years of huge success that they've had as a tourism industry. So they really did actually put volunteerism into action and do something really good with that. How they will go forward is anyone's guess to see where they take it from there. The last note I will end on is something I heard only this morning, so I added it in, and I thought it's a very good message to all of us. Obviously, Thomas Cook is a good example of a tragedy in the industry, and it's had a huge impact both here and around the world for businesses which depended on that tourism. And I've met businesses since the collapse of Thomas Cook which have lost all of their custom because all of their customers came from one source. And it's a message to all of us to diversify the offer and to not depend on any one type of business or any one source of business. But also, here is a very stark warning on technology. So in the MPs select committee that they had where they challenged the chief executives, Harriet Green said, we started opening Apple-type stores. She was referring to the one they had in Bluewater in the southeast of England, where she talked about people queuing outside because they wanted to have this incredible experience. They used augmented reality. They had a very immersive digital experience. They tried to completely revolutionize the in-store experience. And basically her message was, I should have pushed this harder and faster. And when she explained the role that she had in the company, she very much accounted some of its failings to its inability to adapt and react to changes in the market quickly enough. And I think this is something we can all learn from and take on board and be very conscious of the trends, ebbs and flows in digital, in the consumer psyche, and how we need to keep adapting as a business. It's not all about digital either. And that's why I want to end on that message on sustainability. So my final message to you is stay aware of trends and developments in the market, define a really clear strategy, and stay resolutely user-focused. And keep asking yourself, when you think about new technology, is how can I use it to create value for my visitors? Thank you very much.